Hey everyone, welcome to episode 14 of Business Therapy. My name is Sam and I'm here with Jonathan. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date on all of our weekly topics and discussions. Today we're going to be talking about incentives, bonuses, and the like. I know it's Christmas bonus season, so we thought this would be a fun topic to cover today. And I'll start by saying that there's a lot of stuff out there about incentive structures and are bonuses, monetary bonuses, let's say, even the right way to motivate people anymore? And I think the prevailing wisdom is they're really not. I mean, money definitely goes a long way in terms of guaranteed salary and compensation, but all the kind of bonus model, especially the annual bonus model, is a bit under question. So I guess, we wanted to start today by saying, for those of you who are welcoming your Christmas bonuses or getting ready for, closing up for the year and seeing what those annual bonuses look like, is this an exciting time? Is this sort of a stressful time? It's one of those things that I think it varies for a lot of people, and it's an interesting topic to cover. So I'll kick it over to you, Jonathan. Do you have any initial thoughts?
Yeah, and the timing is incredible because over the past several months, we've seen people resign positions when traditionally you wouldn't see people resign in the final quarter of a year because they'd be waiting to see what their increase might be, what their bonus might be. And yet, we've spoken about the impact of COVID and I think we're starting to see it, directly impact incentive structures. It's interesting also because almost every CEO polled says that one of their biggest risks for their enterprise is a lack of skilled labor. And so what are people doing about it? How is anything changing in the face of these facts?
And I don't know if anything's changing. I talk about sort of a related topic. I think compensation models are generally due for a total overhaul culturally, because I think the idea that even you're on a salaried position where you're just paid to be around and be captured by the company versus being paid on production or output is a bit dated generally. But then when you talk about the annual bonus, that's actually closer to an idea of, well, at the end of the year, if you did well or the company did well, you should get this bonus. But in practice, I don't really think it works that way a lot of the time.
Well, it's just a step right before that. It's interesting because the data still shows, I would say, that compensation is still the number one concern for employees. When they're looking at their total job, what we're seeing though is that it's as a percentage of all the things that they're looking at, it's gone down significantly and it's flattened with things that employees are thinking are equally, if not more important. So it's still critical. It's not like employees are, deciding I just want flexible work arrangement or I just want, my purpose, et cetera, at the job. But how do you do it in light of these facts when people are just leaving and not necessarily waiting for the end of the year?
Well, like you said, the idea that it's what's keeping people, I think, is now definitely being thrown out the window, because in the face of an exciting new opportunity or them just being really upset or disengaged or disenchanted with their workplace, an extra few $1,000s at the end of the year, I just don't think it has a staying power, especially with the younger generation that it used to, because there's just so many more exciting things in life and everyone is culturally being more coached to be present. And like we talk about, thinking about, a few $1,000s 6 months down the line is not as exciting as getting a bump now or joining a startup now or doing something that's more exciting right now. So in a way, it's kind of maybe I'm thinking about it in my mind right now as a positive byproduct of the instant gratification culture that a lot of us are getting more used to, which is, you're not going to tie me down to money later when I can have something fun and shiny now. I mean, that's starting to lose, I think, a little bit of its appeal.
I'll put a positive spin on it, not the instant gratification so much as a lot more aware.
Yeah.
So they're starting to, we've said many times that the distinction between work and personal life, there really shouldn't be a distinction. There isn't a distinction. And if you have purpose anywhere, it shouldn't be limited to not work. So you need all those things even at work, and that's that's critical.
Well, you were talking about, I think it's worth talking about incentives first from I've been lately referring to as making people whole with their salary. I think to your point, it almost reminds me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where you have to have your base of your pyramid, your like basic food and shelter and feeling safe first. So for instance, if you're being extorted and you're not being paid a living wage, or you're just not being paid enough to breathe, basically in your personal life, where you can barely afford your bills or your rent, then obviously it's a huge deal. I mean, having that being provided to you is a huge incentive, and I think people are going to be driven towards making sure that's good first. But after that, that's where, once you have that base, you feel whole in terms of, okay, my guaranteed compensation is adequate and I don't feel undervalued and I don't feel under duress personally. After that, a lot of it's becoming marginal, just like they say for every city in the US. I read these stats, throughout my life, where after a certain wage, everything after that is just marginal utility, right? Because, you
And,
can only buy so
and,
many better groceries, or go ahead.
until it becomes golden handcuffs. I mean, there is that scenario.
Yes.
In other words, there is a point at which the money is so substantially higher than what could be found somewhere else that it really makes it hard for someone to be present in their decisions.
Yeah, so now we're establishing the other side of that scale. So there's like the minimum of being satisfied with your income, and then there's your so crazily overpaid that you can't even consider leaving it because it would just be crazy. And then there's everywhere in between. And I think probably the majority of people fall somewhere in between that spectrum, I would
And
imagine.
and just for everyone listening, Maslow's hierarchy of needs starts with safety, physical safety, and the like, and then it progresses up to feeling fulfilled, and valued.
Self-actualization. Yeah.
And exactly. So, and there's some political issues with it in more recent times, but the general idea, if you look at most total talent management programs, they are looking at a hierarchy of needs, let's say.
Yeah. Well, and that's where you think, let's put the golden handcuff aside for a minute, because at that level, you're being paid so much, you're probably being overpaid, which is why the psychology of that is really interesting either, but it's not really as relevant to our incentives conversation, because then
No,
incentives especially don't.
I think it's directly relevant because I think you were starting to say before that let's call them legacy systems. Wait till the end of the year for your increase and your bonus. That's the legacy system.
Yeah.
And the major problem with that obviously is it's not tied to specific behavior. So like you do a great job, you do a bad job, it's like taxes at the end of the year. It's happening at that time. And I think that's the same thing with golden handcuffs. It gets to be such a high amount. There's no relationship almost to what you're actually doing. And maybe it's to safeguard you staying there, but I think both kind of disconnect at some point your immediate present activity to your compensation.
Yes, that's fair. They both definitely, to your point, have an impact on how you are incentivized from a compensation standpoint, for sure. I guess it's this in the first section where you're not even up to the minimum level, your base is not met. That's going to be you're highly incentivized. You could be really needing that bonus at the end of the year. It could be the thing that gives you relief for the first half of your year, depending on how much it is or what it is. And then that could truly be an incentive. But also it's trying to cultivate that by underpaying people or paying them at a level where they can barely live. I don't think that sets up a healthy foundation or a healthy culture for a business. I mean, typically not.
And coupled with the generation now, and I think the most coveted generation for a lot of the positions that are absolutely need to be filled, they're aware of their circumstance, even if their salary is appropriate. So in other words, even if the salary would meet someone's normal needs, if the person has debt or has some other problems, that's how they're looking at their salary on some level. I'm often not seeing it in terms of a scale of expectation so much as I need this need met and it's not being met this way. I don't know if I'm getting too much into the psychology of it.
I don't think so. You're saying, and just make sure I understand what you just said, you're saying that for most people, they just have an expectation. It doesn't matter whether it's above or below their minimum threshold for being comfortable objectively. And if it's not met, it's not met.
Well, that's a better point than I was making. So maybe we go with that. I'll just say yes, no. I'm saying that I think the younger generation now is looking at it not that, oh, this is a reasonable salary that should cover my needs. If their particular circumstance includes additional needs, then they're not understanding on some level. And I know like this is aggressive to say, but they're not understanding why that gap isn't being addressed in the workplace.
Oh, I see. So
So
basically,
like student loans.
it's
So
the
if I have,
entitled. You're making a subtle argument that people are entitled, basically.
I think on some level. Now, if I had a choice between a certain sense of entitlement, but being far more aware of value and the culture of your organization, and not being, having some legacy idea of allegiance to something that you don't believe in, I'll take that entitlement coupled with it, because I think that'll mature over time. So I'll
Yeah.
balance out my comment.
Well, I actually think that's where this podcast to me needed to go anyway. And I think it is the critical point, which is, does it really matter if they're entitled, if their expectations are on another planet, if they don't it doesn't really matter. And I think that's a big part of the incentive conversation for me, which is that, if the norm is you get this annual increase in bonus, and if you're not happy with it, that's something that's off in your expectations, it's not going to help you retain employees because it's their expectations. I think you're gonna have to meet them, right?
Well, I mean, in an environment where talent is so critical,
Yeah.
if employees are willing to leave and then you're going to counter offer anyway, or you're going to give additional money for the people who identify as flight risks, or, you're breaking your structure anyway, and you're basically giving into their, whatever their needs are, because you're so desperate, because you're starting to look at the employee very differently. Let's say that employee is responsible for a certain amount of revenue that's coming in, or certain relationships. It might be completely outsized to what their current salary is, but you're going to look at it as a business. It's easy to look at that employee when they're just doing what they're doing and getting paid what they're getting paid. But the second you start thinking, oh, what would I do if they were leaving, if they were going to resign? What would I counter for? That's actually the space you should probably be looking at, considering your staff from.
Well, and yeah, exactly. And well, that's a whole nother issue with incentives, where they're always trying to push incentives down and push compensation down, and then they pay for it with all the turnover and all the excess costs of like replacing staff and attrition. And it's just, maybe we'll have time to go into that a little bit, but I don't want to lose the line of thinking that we're on, which is, it doesn't matter. Like, if you want an employee, it doesn't matter what their expectation is. You have to understand it, and you have to try to meet their expectation. And if it's super crazy and you can't do it as a business, then that's fine, and then it's probably not a good fit. But I think the idea that you're going to bully somebody into a salary level or a bonus structure or a combination of all thereof, that's not what they want for themselves, whether it's rational or not, that's a harder road to take. If you think about the effort, like, think about the process that we're describing. It's sort of culturally normalized, I think, at this point, which is, oh, you don't know what you're worth, so I'm going to tell you, and then you need to just learn, or somehow, right size your own thinking so that you align with what you're getting paid. That's a hard thing to do. It'd be easier to just ask people up front. This is kind of where I'm at in my career now, which is, what would you want to feel good, to like feel like you had everything you needed? And let's start the conversation there, and then try to meet them there, because if you can just meet them there, then you're starting a working relationship with a balanced energy, and they're not having to constantly prove themselves or shortchange themselves or create this tense narrative. And like, if you can't meet them there as an employer, then you just say that. But having this dance of, can I drive them down, or can I convince them that what they expect to make them happy is not right? That's a conversation we're ultimately having with people, and I think it's really high effort and crazy a lot of the time.
As a general rule, obviously we're very in favor of transparency. So like, what are the factors? Why did you decide what somebody's worth is, whatever you think their worth is? And putting a different spin on it, what I would often do if I found somebody who was particularly ambitious or thought that their needs weren't being met, I would say, if you can achieve X, or if you can cover ABC responsibilities, you'd be worth this amount that you think you should have, and do that, and I'm happy to pay for that value. And it's a conversation about what the value is and why, and then it gives somebody a target, as opposed to explaining to them why they should be okay with whatever number they have.
Yeah. Well, value-based and objective-based compensation, or actually paying for production, that I truly believe is the future. Really, the conversation we're having is in lieu of that. I
No,
would
no,
say to some extent.
I think that's where we're going. I think I'll just
Yeah.
caution that the challenge, why is this annual review process and um, uh, annual bonus process stayed in place for so long in the face of all this turnover and all the costs that Sam mentioned? There's some significant legal issues with treating employees who are in the same role disparately, and everyone's very afraid of that risk. So it's not so easy just to tailor everything. And this process has been tried and true. It's been going on for a very long time. So people are trained in it culturally. They understand it. They understand the back and forth, when to get HR involved, et cetera. So the program administration processes and costs and everything, it's all set. We're just hitting a point now where if you want to retain talent in the future, whatever costs or risks you're going to incur by not, staying within that safe old framework, it's going to get outstripped by your loss of talent. You won't be competitive.
And just that's such an important, just to put it in reference, like you said, it's been happening the same way for so long. That has been happening for decades. The idea that we're going to placate our staff by having this annual review cycle, annual sort of Christmas bonus mentality, that was happening before the internet. Like, if you think just like this has been going on and has been common practice for a few decades, that means when we were in a whole generation of business where things were moving orders of magnitude slower than they do now, that was still the same compensation cycle, the still annual review cycle that they were still using. If you said that about anything else in your business, that we're gonna be running this same strategy that we were using in 1985 to make our employees happy, that wouldn't really make any sense. But that's kind of still what we do with compensation. And that's the
and
funny
a
thing.
Whole host of other things.
Yes, and other things too. But for incentives, we're still running that. I would say, from working with younger people, if you actually updated it to the times and you did a salary review and a bonus structure every quarter, that might start approaching the pace that younger people want to have those conversations and want to start working. But then that's what I'm saying. It begs the question of why even try to have continuity in that sort of cycle process, or everyone sort of lockstep. I mean, you're basically going to see that the logic is going to get you to the point where if you were reading the environment correctly, this would be an ongoing conversation, and it would be more flexible at its foundation anyway. Because I mean, nobody cares about the annual bonus unless, like you said, they need it, they really need it, or it's just, I guess it's for them, it's some game. I guess, I mean, it's really, like I said,
No,
I would almost be, I'd be
I wouldn't-
dismissive in some ways.
I wouldn't ascribe any negative to it. I really, I mean, there are some significant legal challenges when managers just can do whatever they want. And then you have to explain why this person got more than that person. I mean, there are some significant issues there, and there are costs. I think one of the things that employers have tried doing is nip at the heels of what you're saying, Sam. So they've increased perks, they've increased total reward, programs. They've increased some peer-to-peer kind of bonuses that could occur based on nominations and things like that. The problem with those is it's a program for everybody, and it's not looking at the individual context. And coupled with the fact that now everyone does it, so that becomes just table stakes. So It's really hard to have general programs address the issue that I think we're talking about.
I agree, and I hear you completely on the legal challenges, and also the sort of the equality and the disparity, and a lot of the the issues that plague organizations. But like we're talking about incentive from the employee's perspective, and if you're a manager and you're trying to retain talent, it doesn't fly with people to say, this is a real legal challenge and a real puzzle for us. We can't pay you more, talk about paying you more, because everyone else wants the same thing. And we just, we need to be like, nobody's going to buy that. It's not that they won't buy it. It's commonplace and they understand it. But again, it's not going to help them meet their expectations. It's not going to make them feel whole. And if they don't feel whole, there's just tension. There's always going to be tension. You're going to lose them. So, at some point, it has to be on the onus has to be on the employer to start to figure these things out.
I've consulted with employers that were concerned that, with just that then if you say that this is what it takes, then everyone's going to want, to make more, so like if you were having that conversation with everybody because so-and-so was, got more, now you're opening it up because you're saying, well, I did as good a project as that person, that you're saying you have to pay more. And what I would say to that is, if everyone in your workforce can exceed your expectations and you give great goals and everyone's creating all this value, you should be happy. You should be happy to pay them more. Like that's a good problem to have. I think people feel like that's going to be out of control. I need to control this. I need to, predict exactly, I know what my budget is for the year. I know everything. But if you set the goals right, and if you have a good, set good objectives and people are exceeding them, everybody across the board, good problem to have.
Yeah, well, now we're talking about incentive structures holistically in terms of how it matches like a more conscious company, because we talked about trust last week. The idea that you just articulated, that, well, if we just asked everyone what they wanted, they would just rob us, like they would just take all the money out of the coffers and the business would die. That's like a fundamental mistrust and a misunderstanding of the relationship you have with your employee, in my opinion. Because the employee, like you said, is part of the company. They want the company to do well. They want to be part of contributing to the company doing well, and they also want to feel that positive contribution is rewarded in kind, which makes sense. So one would posit, like you just said, if everyone's doing well, that means the company should be doing much better, and then that should be returned to the employees. And there's this idea that, well, if the employees could be paid whatever they wanted, it would be reckless and irresponsible. And I don't understand where that mentality comes from. And I think it's like you said, part of it is coupled to the lack of transparency. If they would ask for some outsized salary that would hurt the company, I think for a lot of people, if you told them that and you gave them some vision into, you know, this is what other people are making around you. This is sort of what we can. This is what this contribution is usually worth. And also, if we paid you increasing amounts, we'd have to pull that from other areas. And this is how it impacts the business. People start to understand they're part of a greater whole, and nobody wants to take more than their share at the expense of their colleagues, at the expense of the viability of the company. For the most part, I think I don't know. It's sort of this toxic narrative that I think is very institutionalized. That people are just out for themselves, and they don't really, their incentives have to be just enough to placate them, just enough to keep them hooked and on board and control our costs. But they don't really have any ownership or responsibility over the well-being of the company. And I think that's a much bigger conversation. But you know what I'm saying.
I do think that it's enough if you're very transparent about the factors, as opposed to telling anyone, well, you select whatever salary you want. Just know if it's too high, it could crater the company. Like I think you'd want some governing rules and governance over it. But that being said, I think transparency goes a long way.
Well, I think it'd be a lot if we switched overnight. Like if you have like a large multinational and you've got thousands of employees, you're not going to go from the way they've been handled to tomorrow saying, tell me a number and I'll tell you how it's going to impact your team and it's going to impact the group, and like pick a number that's responsible. You're now like an ownership mentality. I mean, no one's trained to think that way. So I agree with you that would be reckless, but I'm now envisioning more of a future facing company that you'd have to kind of have that culture from the beginning where everyone has that
I was going to
fiduciary
say,
responsibility.
if you're an organizationally immature company, I don't know that I would recommend this, because that means that you're already probably not connecting with the type of talent to whom this would matter, or to top level talent. Frankly, it means you probably have a lot of day players, salary, people that are just 9 to 5. Because at some point, if you're not a transparent organization, if your managers are all micromanagers, if you don't know what your objectives are as an organization, if you don't know what your value is, if you don't value the individual employee, trying to do this, it's not authentic and you're going to fail. So I think you have to address those issues first before, attempt, because this is a transformation level project. I mean, at the end of the day, and that's a lot of change and a lot of effort.
And it kind of always comes back around for us that if you're going to attempt to change sort of the templates that everyone's using, you've got to be more mature as an organization. You've got to really push the envelope, like you just said, on a lot of different dimensions. You got to be more open. You got to have real conversations. You have to be authentic. And that's a hard thing to do. That's not something that happens overnight. And I know it's the cause of a lot of frustration for more people, because like we've talked about, that expectation for more authenticity in the workplace is becoming more prevalent. I think as a macro trend, I think even if people can't articulate it that way, we live in a more transparent world. We live in a digital world where more information is available and people are more open to access it. And people want that at work. And people are not ready to create processes and operating models that allow for that, especially around incentives, compensation.
Well, there are some bright spots. There are some, forward-looking companies out there that are doing giving more flexibility to how often the year increases can occur and based on activity of the employee. So that is happening. We're seeing that. We're also seeing employees desperately try and leverage analytics to really understand who's adding value and how as a justification for the, different compensation. So these are interesting, developments.
Well, the incoming generation, I've seen it. They're trained in school and college to manage up with data, and it makes it much more compelling.
That's 100%.
I mean, and that's gonna really challenge all the managers out there, because I hesitate to call them kids, but it's like the kids kind of in the workplace, the greenhorns that are coming in their early 20s are showing up every quarter and saying, here's my numbers, here's what I produced, here's like a report, I've tracked everything, here's an audit log of all the things I've done, and like I think I cleared the threshold for a raise early by like 6 months. And then what do you say? It didn't used to be that way.
And that is a beautiful problem to have. I mean,
Yeah.
and when you're transparent about your objectives so that they can compile that data, that's awesome. Now, people are afraid to let go of that control, but I think that's brilliant. Where I think it's circling, or where I think it's heading, the compensation model is, I'll think of it as like context compensation, looking at the individual's context and making your compensation model flexible enough and configurable enough to really speak to each individual employee. Based on where they are in life, based in, it changes by age range, there's particular needs that they might have, et cetera. So I think that that's ultimately what's going to address both the reason people are resigning from companies and make this more sustainable.
Yeah, and again, like everything going on in process, we talked about it earlier. If you think about the model that Jonathan's even, suggesting right there, where it's more modulating. We go from annual, let's say, to quarterly to make people happier. We go from quarterly to like discussing whatever you want, and eventually, like all things, this model is just going to be fluid and it's going to be more present, because that's the future of all process, especially in the digital age. Like if you look at it from a macro level, and I know that's frightening for people to say, well, you don't have an annual W-2 contract that just changes by 3% every year. How are we supposed to manage that? That's an HR challenge. That's a finance challenge, but that's going to be the future. You can avoid it all you want. You can not set objectives. You can just tell your employees, I will review you at the end of the year and you will get a raise based on my discretion. And you are going to have trouble retaining employees because it's already starting to happen out there. And like where we started the podcast, the punchline is, not so subtly, the annual bonus, people don't care as much anymore. And like Jonathan said, I'm not saying that it's not good. It's always good to give your people more. Like that doesn't mean go and use this podcast as justification to pull all the bonuses out and say like, nobody cares. And they're, but it's not going to hold anybody. If you told somebody who started in January, well, this is really exciting, but if you do a good job, we'll talk in December about how that's going to impact you. Nobody, that doesn't connect with anyone anymore.
And even if the money is holding someone, if that's the only thing holding them, their level of engagement is very low.
Yeah.
So, and their output and their contribution isn't going to be much better. So in the idea of like looking at the individual, we're saying you need to look at like what they're doing right. So if they just completed some great project, if the market has shifted in terms of salary ranges, if anything that would say that somebody deserves, or the example Sam gave of somebody meets all their objectives 6 months early, all these things you should be able to be flexible enough to change the salary or give a bonus at that time. So there's a direct connection, because if we're called, they're incentives, they're called incentives. So you're incentivizing behavior. The way to incentivize behavior is not to give the pellet, 6 months after they do whatever, you have to give it at the time. And I think I'm also suggesting that you couple that ability with looking at the individual. And, managers always say, like, how do you do the balance of caring about the person's home life and any problems they're having? And, like, how do you balance being a human employer? I'm saying plan for it. In other words, there are certain needs that people have throughout their life, specific scenarios, caring for a loved one, or at different ages, like they care about a mortgage at some point, they care about, college, et cetera. Anticipate that and blend in life to your compensation model and have that capability. And then you're going to address really what I think ultimately people are looking for.
And that covers exactly what I was saying earlier when I say make your people whole. And that means anticipate that they're going to need things from you and be able to give them to them. That's how you take care of employees. That's how you incentivize them. And it's kind of the irony of just treat them like people and take care of them. And I know sometimes that sounds, it sounds simpler than it is in execution for employers because there is a lot of red tape and there's a lot of rules. But generally, if you're thinking about, well, how can I incentivize my employees if the bonus structures are not working, if the money is marginal at certain configurations, the answer is get to know them, talk to them, ask them what they need. Like Jonathan said, be flexible, be ready to meet them when they need to be met for support. Because like you said, the worst thing you can do is the pellet delayed. When you're expecting to pull the lever and get a reward and the reward can't come for 6 months, you may as well not even set that structure up because you're just setting them up to be more frustrated. And we see that a lot. So go ahead. Sorry, you had a thought?
No, I'm sorry, my connection's a little off. Go, Sam. Just continue with your thought. So I don't.
Yeah. So that really that was kind of closing that thought, which is what do people need? And I think that brings us back to we had a question just a few minutes ago about, well, is it good to have bonus structures that are not monetary? And Jonathan kind of touched on this lightly a few minutes ago around, do you give them extra PTO? Do you give them extra, training money? And I think all these things are good, and companies are trying to set up different structures, to do these things. But like Jonathan mentioned, they're getting commoditized and then they just become baseline. Everyone wants good training. Everyone wants, if one company starts offering it, everyone wants the buffet, laundry on site. I mean, who knows? I mean, there's lots of perks, but I think the real thing is there's no one size fits all for incentives. I think that it's what Jonathan touched on, which is really, in my opinion, the heart of everything, which is college stuff comes up, family stuff comes up. There's things that happen in people's lives, and they want to know that their employer is an entity in their life that can listen to them and support them as their needs change. And I think the more an employer can do that, whether it's money, whether it's time, extra time off, whether it's people coming together to support them when they need it, it's that whole feeling heard and having the employer behave like an actual person that cares about you that I think for me is the punchline.
And while I think that it's good for managers to be human, et cetera, I think that in the absence of a structure or program or to be supportive in a meaningful way, you'll have managers like run the gamut of, that's your personal life. Let's just look at the policy and follow the policy, and that's the end of that. Or you have managers who will go to the person's home and, get very involved, et cetera. And that, neither of it is fully healthy, or potentially could be, but probably not. It's much better if if you can do things like make for a better mortgage, or give the person time off, or give someone a sabbatical, or whatever it is that is going to, whatever combination or configuration of program that's going to help, so that when the person looks back, they say, my company was part of my personal support network, in a meaningful way, and that's where you build trust and connectivity.
And I guess that brings us, if I was going to start summarizing this conversation on incentives, is if you really want to incentivize people, you need to incentivize by building a relationship with them, an authentic relationship. And I just had a kind of an analogy pop into my head. It's the idea that this whole Christmas thing, I'm kind of poo-poo on Christmas too, mechanically. I don't want to, I'm not disparaging anyone's religious affiliation with the event. I'm just saying, if your relationship, let's say with your family, is that you give them Christmas presents on Christmas, and they come home every year expecting, your kids come home every year and you expect to get $500 and a few presents, and that's your interaction with them for the year. That's not a relationship. If you give them presents throughout the year and you ask them and you give them money when they need it, then you're listening, there's connectivity, you're creating a bond. That's
I
what employees want. They don't
I
want the
o-
thing.
I always hated gifts at a scheduled date, a
Yeah,
birthday or whatever, because it's almost impossible to connect the emotion you feel for that person on schedule. Whereas if you give a gift when you feel it, the gift is going to have a lot more impact. It's the same thing with salary and increase.
yeah,
At the end of the year, you're going to say, you'll remember certain things. You probably won't remember the things the employee thinks you should remember about what they did during the year. You might remember the most current mess up that they had, but the feeling while you're giving it is is always very, very disconnected. So the ability to do something in the moment is a lot more powerful.
yeah. And you don't want to be Santa keeping a naughty or nice list all year long. Like, does that really incentivize children? I don't know. I mean, I've never seen naughty children be less naughty because they're afraid that the naughty list is growing and they're not going to get presents. They're getting the presents at the end of the year regardless. They don't care. Nobody actually gets coal anymore for the most part. I mean, some of you out there might give your kids coal, but I mean, that's the thing. It just becomes hollow in some ways. Like you said, it becomes routine. And I think that's the biggest thing that people want now. They tire of routine. They know it's coming. They want the connection now. And I think that's the biggest thing. People are not going to leave a company when they actually feel connected and cared for at that company. I mean, if they do, it will be a conversation that's beneficial for both sides. If you don't create a relationship, there is no incentive. You can give all the things. You can give the playroom and the bonuses and all the things. But if you're absent as the employer, as the manager, it's just the same as like, a father who works all the time and buys a mansion for their children to play in, but they're just in it alone. There's nothing there that ties them to that. It's hollow. It's meaningless
Hmm.
in a lot of ways.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Hollow. Uh, I I think that the connectivity comes from it being clear that this is an investment. When you're paying somebody or giving somebody something as an employer, people want to feel invested in. And your thought process on what you're giving them, it shouldn't be like either on one hand you're like Santa, because you're not Santa. The person worked for whatever it is. They earned that, so that doesn't exist. Or they feel begrudging that how much of this could I have kept, or did the person fully deserve it? Or if you're getting into that whole mindset, you're not going to
Yeah.
create any engagement with that individual, from it being clear that you're like so parsimonious and like, clinging on to that last dime or whatever it is. You have to look at it as an investment, and an investment like
Yeah.
more like a mutual fund investment where you're not tracking it every single day or every single moment. You're saying, this is going to be over, time, and I know there's going to be value there.
Yeah, it's like and that would be the equivalent of the worst Santa ever, where they're actually nice all year and they're keeping their list. And at the end of the year, he's got his full sack on his back. And he's like, well, how nice really were you?
Yeah.
Like, how many presents do
Or
you actually deserve?
yeah. Or these are nice toys. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's just, I think generally, everything displaced in time is less value. And I think that's really, if you, I think for me, if you feel like you're bound to incentives that people have to work towards all like over any period of time, and then they get rewarded at the end, it's a very common convention. And I think you're losing people. That's kind of the observation.
100%. And also, if you're trying to react to the reasons people say they resign, and there's all these surveys out there about, they either wanted flexible work or they didn't feel like they were adding value because they weren't able to, in that environment, or, all these other reasons. You're probably not going to address it in your compensation model. Like that's the kind of things you need to address as a company, as a, like we said before, the trust, the lack of micromanagement, having a strategy that everyone understands, being transparent. Like that's how you address those things. And I think if you're not willing to address those things, you're probably never going to be fully ready to play in this environment for talent.
Yeah, and I mean, it'd be like, it'd be kind of telling somebody, hey, if your dating strategy is you want to make your girlfriend break up with you want to get her to the point where she's willing to break up with you before you're ready to talk to her about what you're willing to change to keep her in the relationship, it's probably not a great strategy for marriage. It's not a great strategy for, because then you could bring her back, but I mean, it hurts. I mean, that's a painful way to do it. And I don't see a lot of relationships that have that dynamic where it's like, I'm breaking up with you, I just can't deal with it anymore. And then they're like, okay, I know I have to make a big change. And then they get back together. And then they break up 3 months later and it's the same thing. but this is what we encourage. This is with employees. It's kind of how it is. I mean, and the incentives are, well, you're so fed up with me, I could throw you a counter offer, or I could throw you this thing. And that's what you've been talking about the whole podcast. I just think it's crazy. I mean,
And the bullet you have to bite is if you really are invested in your employees, and it is best for this particular employee to leave, you have to do that with grace, And that's how you build an alumni network. That's how you build the future. You know, the smart companies do that very, very well. They don't begrudge the person leaving, and you're like, you walk out that door, you're dead to me. You know, like they don't do that. You know, they're like, they assess it, they give input, and if it's best, they do it with grace.
Yeah, it's another breakup analogy. Also, when I was younger, I used to do that. If we had break up with somebody, we wouldn't talk anymore. But as I've gotten older, breakups I think do go smoother when you leave an open communication channel. You're willing to process the relationship with one another. You're willing to support each other, and that's a mature thing to do. And a lot of people find that that's very tough with your exes. Same thing with employees. It's the same dynamic, though. You don't want to create a dynamic where when they break up with you, you never talk again, because like Jonathan said, that actually prevents an alumni network from even being possible with great talent.
They might be a customer. They might have a key relationship. They might, and talk about awkward. Oh, I didn't know you were here. You were with him. Now, anyway, I think for me, that's a good note for me to end on. I don't know if you have any final thought.
I mean, I could do another 10 minutes on relationship trauma, but I think, it's probably as good as the time as any to cut it off. All right. So thanks for joining us and talking about incentives, a little bit of Christmas bonus talk. Really appreciate it. And I just want to say happy holidays to everybody. Yeah, it's been fun coming up to this point. So we look forward to, I guess we'll have one more podcast before the new year. Maybe not. Well, in either case, we'll see you then before the new year. So enjoy your holidays, and we will talk next week.